Rome, the eternal city, is famous for its grandeur, architectural marvels, and complex societal structures. But behind its shining glory lies a dark and often forgotten history, especially regarding the treatment of women. In ancient Rome, women were not only expected to uphold the household, but also bear a sacred responsibility that connected them to the divine. However, despite their revered status, Rome's sacred women were subjected to some of the most severe and unbelievable forms of punishment. The most famous of these women were the Vestal Virgins, high-ranking priestesses who served the goddess Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home. They were given privileges that were rare for women of their time. They could own property. They had a special place in the Senate, and they even had the right to choose their marriage partners. If a Vestal Virgin were found guilty of breaking her vow, the punishment was severe and shocking. The Roman authorities would lead the convicted Vestal into a small underground chamber, where she would be left to die, sealed off from the world. This form of execution was not only a punishment for the woman herself, but was meant to symbolize the severing of her connection with Rome as sacred institutions. Her death was considered a purification of Rome, a necessary sacrifice to appease the gods and restore the city's favor. Yet, despite their revered position, their punishment for breaking the sacred vow of chastity was one of the most brutal in Roman history. In a society where divine rules were intertwined with daily life, her punishment speaks volumes about the way women were held accountable for their actions. Their role in society was seen as essential to Rome's very existence, yet any violation of their sacred vows or duties was met with swift and unrelenting punishment, even when those actions were the result of divine will. Any failure in these sacred duties was seen as a potential threat to Rome's survival, and the punishment for such failures was a reminder of how fragile their civilization was. Women accused of adultery or perceived moral failure were often publicly humiliated, subjected to trials, and in some cases, exiled or executed. These punishments reflected the rigid and often brutal nature of Roman society, where honor and public reputation were everything. Their stories, though often tragic, highlight the complex nature of ancient civilizations and the unbelievable ways in which they enforced their sacred codes. The divine and the mortal, the Vestal Virgins, revered for their connection to the divine, faced punishments that seem unthinkable today, all for failing to uphold the sacred vows they made. These stories reflect the complex relationship between religion, power, and gender in ancient Rome and remind us of the often overlooked sacrifices made by women throughout history, but were accused of failing in their duties, such as letting the fire of Vesta go out, were subjected to similar fates. The pressure of their sacred duties weighed heavily on these women. The result was a pregnancy that led to the birth of the twins. Her story is a mixture of divine intervention and tragic consequence. While the birth of Romulus and Remus eventually led to the founding of Rome, Rhea Silvia's punishment was not as kind. She was imprisoned, and her punishment, while not involving death, was one of isolation and disgrace. It is said that she was cast into the river, bound in chains. Though she survived to see her sons become the founders of the city she helped bring into being. And any failure, no matter how small, could lead to catastrophic consequences. The case of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia, the punishment for a broken vow. The story of Rhea Silvia is one of legend, as she was the mother of the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. These women held a position of power and respect, entrusted with the sacred flame that symbolized the eternal fire of Rome. They were chosen at a young age and swore an oath of chastity for 30 years, a promise that tied their destiny to the city's well-being. However, the question arises, how could such revered figures in Roman society, though seen as almost divine, face punishment in ways that seem unimaginable to us today? The answer lies in the strict religious and moral codes that governed Roman society. They were responsible for maintaining the eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta, a fire that could not be allowed to go out under any circumstances. The purity of the Vestals was directly tied to the well-being of Rome itself. It was believed that as long as the Vestal Virgins remained chaste and the flame remained lit, Rome would prosper. While these women were considered the most sacred, their punishment could be swift, harsh, and unforgiving. The role of the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins were chosen from the noblest Roman families and trained to uphold the sacred rites of Vesta. Their duties were no small feat. These women were venerated and held in high esteem by the Roman people. Breaking the vow of chastity was considered not just a personal failure, but a direct affront to the gods themselves. One of the most horrifying aspects of this punishment was the method of execution. The woman would be buried alive. But the punishment didn't end there. In some cases, even the women who were not found guilty of infidelity, perhaps. The most famous story that illustrates the unbelievable nature of Rome's punishment for its sacred women involves the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia. According to the myth, Rhea Silvia was a Vestal Virgin who was forced to break her vow of chastity when the god Mars visited her in disguise. Rhea Silvia's case is a complex one because it mixes the sacred with the profane. What makes the story of the Vestal Virgins and other sacred women in Rome particularly striking is the stark contrast between the power and reverence these women held and the punishments they endured. The Omans believed that their city was under the constant protection of the gods, and that the conduct of their most sacred women played a direct role in the city's fortunes. Punishments for other women, while not as extreme, were still harsh by modern standards. The unbelievable punishments faced by Rome's most sacred women serve as a sobering reminder of how women in ancient times were held to a higher and often impossible standard. In the grand tapestry of Roman history, the women who upheld the sacred rituals were more than mere followers. They were the backbone of Roman society's spiritual life.